Okay, everybody, welcome, and yes, happy President's Day. Here we are. My name is Daniel Canstro, and as Faculty Director of the Rappaport Center here at Boston College Law School, it is a great pleasure on behalf of myself, our Executive Director, Lissy Medvedow, our Administrative Assistant, Abby Chingo, to welcome you all to this first encounter with our current Senior Fellow, Kimberly Atkins, Stohr. I want to remind people this event is also being streamed on Zoom and it's being recorded. When we do a Q&A, I think we'll be able to take some cues from the Zoom as well, but just know that it is being recorded. As we hope that you know by now, the Senior Fellows Program is an essential and wonderfully successful component of some new initiatives that we created around 2020. The idea was to enhance Rappaport Center programming, which focuses on important issues of law and public policy, which offers a wonderful fellowship program over the summer, hosts many conferences and symposia, and also invites a distinguished professor to Boston College for a semester. A cohort that has recently included Jeffrey Robinson, former Senator Doug Jones, Richard Cordray from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, former Governors Jane Swift, Daniel Malloy, and Martin O'Malley, former SJC Justices Robert Cordy and Geraldine Hines, and former U.S. Attorney Carmen Ortiz. The essential idea behind the Senior Fellows Program was to invite a diverse cohort of exciting, successful, mid-career professionals, including academics, practitioners, and activists who work on cutting-edge issues of law and public policy. So we invite them to come here for a very intense, brief but spectacular, as they say, visit in which we would learn from them and they would get to know us, especially our students, with whom we hope they will work and develop future professional relationships and perhaps research projects. Our most recent Senior Fellows last year were Danielle Kinkle, General Counsel of the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, and Chesa Boudin, the former District Attorney of San Francisco. We are honored and thrilled today to introduce this spring's Senior Fellow, Kimberly Atkins Stohr, who I should also note has generously participated in Rappaport Center programming in the recent past, and who is therefore already a treasured member of our community, even apart from the excellent work that she does regularly. Let me read you her bio, and then I'll tell you what she's going to talk about. So Kimberly Atkins Stohr is a senior opinion writer and columnist for the Boston Globe. For the students in the room, that's a newspaper. She was also the inaugural columnist for The Emancipator, a joint independent anti-racist multimedia project from Globe Opinion, Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research, and she's the author of its newsletter, Unbound. She's an MSNBC contributor, co-host of the Politicon podcast, #Sisters in Law. Previously, Atkins Stohr was the first Washington, D.C.-based news correspondent for WBUR. She served in the Boston Herald's Washington Bureau, has been guest host of C-SPAN's morning call-in shows, Washington Journal, and a Supreme Court reporter for Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly and sister publications. She began as an intern at the Boston Globe, has appeared as a political commentary on many national, international television and radio networks, and before that, she was a trial and appellate attorney in Boston. She was cured, apparently, but she still writes on law and public policy with a very sophisticated legalistic eye. She's a native of Michigan, a graduate of Wayne State University, Boston University School of Law, and the Boston University College of Communication, and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Her talk today, which will be followed by a Q&A session, is entitled, quote, "Where the Biometric Buck Stops, Accountability for Facial Recognition Bias." I want to just let people know that we're also presenting a panel presentation with Kim as moderator on Wednesday, and that's entitled Facial Recognition, Exploring Privacy, Profiling, and Public Safety, with panelists William G. Brooks III from the Norwood Police Department, he's the chief, Cade Crockford, director of the Technology for Liberty program of the ACLU, and Elspeth Seifer, former Associate Justice of the SJC, and the Huber Distinguished Visiting Professor now at Boston College Law. Lunch from Anna's Taqueria will be provided if you RSVP today. By the end of business today, by the end of President's Day. So without further ado, let's welcome Kimberly Atkins Stohr.
so much for that really wonderful and generous introduction, and it is an honor to be here. I hope you don't hold my BU affiliation against me. So I want to start off by saying I'm really nervous because I'm usually used to, I'm not an academic. I've never been an academic. I've been a student a lot, as you could hear from my bio. So I'm usually used to sitting out there, and actually the people in the back, I see you. Like, that was me in law school and elsewhere. So I am a little nervous, and I'm a newspaper opinion columnist, right? I'm not a professor. And so I thought about how to approach this, and this essentially would be how I would approach writing a column about an issue. I identify an issue that I think needs to be addressed and perhaps thought about in a different way. I sort of lay it out, and then I propose some solutions and hope that anybody out there might see it and it can add to that dialogue. So that's how I am approaching this. I certainly am not a facial recognition expert, but I'm somebody who cares very deeply about the way that it's implemented. So I hope you take this talk in that vein. And just so that we get our definitions out there, when I talk about facial recognition technology, I'm talking about the AI that uses machine learning and incorporates that by creating algorithms that can identify facial patterns based on the data of other facial patterns that it has at its disposal, right? One thing this won't be is a facial recognition tech bashing session, because I think facial recognition technology is great. It has a wonderful potential and reality to really bring about much needed benefits to our society. It aids and advances medical research and treatment. It can create more personal security, financial security. It's important for national security, right? And it can find missing people, and it can be used to help solve crimes as well. And, it makes our lives a lot easier. Come on, who likes doing this? Right? That's a lot easier than doing this, right? And, breezing through the global entry line at the airport, that's great. Like that, facial recognition technology brings you all of that. It is a very good thing. And that's why the market is booming. That's an important thing to think about. I try to identify areas that we miss when we're talking about things like this. It is an industry. In fact, it's such a big industry that according to a report by Inside Partners, in 2021, it was a $5 billion industry. It's projected by 2028 to be a $13 billion industry. Companies aren't just doing this for altruistic purposes. There's a lot of money to be made by creating, developing, and selling facial recognition technology. So that's important to keep in mind. And that growth is being driven not just because of the private sector, but also because municipalities, governments, including police departments, love it. And they have been buying it and using it and implementing it. So that's sort of an important consideration, as is the fact that just law enforcement alone, according to a Georgetown Law report, 1 out of every 4 state and local law enforcement agencies were using some sort of facial recognition technology in 2016. In 2021, according to the Government Accountability Office, half of all federal law enforcement agencies were using some form of facial recognition technology in their work. So it is out there, it is being used, and it is being used widely. Now, one thing to keep in mind with those points as we have this whole discussion is think about competing interests in the discussion and the debate over how and when the technology should and shouldn't be used. We hear a lot from activists who worry about a lot of the civil rights and privacy issues that I'm going to touch on today. You also have folks who really want to see it continue to be used. Corporations, who I will talk about Microsoft in a minute, police departments, they like it. It helps them do their job. And right now it is true that some police departments are dealing with staffing shortages, recruiting needs, and they want the things that will make things easier for them to do their job. So those are some competing interests there that you need to keep in mind. But the truth is that this technology, as wonderful as it is full of a lot of risks that we're being able to see. And today I want to focus on bias, the bias that is often built into the algorithm, either unintentionally or intentionally. It is in there. So let's do a little exercise to talk about technological bias for those of you who have these out. Do a search on Google or whatever your search engine of choice is, and search, just for yourselves, you don't have to shout anything out, search beautiful face and see what images come up on that. As you look at those images, take a look. What do they have in common? What do they not have in common? What you see, what you don't see in those images, just at first glance. Now do the same search on the same engine for the word thug, T-H-U-G, and see what images come up, and what they have in common and what they don't have. All right? That is AI. That is a machine that learned how to respond to your search. It didn't know these words before the data behind them was put in, but look at what it puts out. That's a really easy way to see how the bias can be built in. And when I talk bias, I'm talking about a lot of things today. When I say racial bias, I am talking not just about as between different races, I am also talking about things like hair, things like facial hair, things like different shades of skin. When I'm talking about gender bias, I'm not just talking about women having less accurate recognition. I'm talking about other trans folks, non-binary folks. And when I'm talking about privacy and security concerns, I'm talking about a lot of things, including the fact that our data, when it comes to other data like fingerprints or DNA, there's at least some places where it's contained. Not everyone can get to it. Everyone can get to your face. Like, you can be walking down the street and someone can take a picture of you, right? It's less protections there. Your picture is online. My picture is online a lot. People can find that and forget about deepfakes, right? You can't really keep your face private, so it makes it a really big issue when it comes to security. So before we get into what accountability in this might look like, which is the topic today, I want to talk a little bit, I think it's important to remember what we already know about government surveillance, period, right? Our history is replete with examples of surveillance being used at a disproportionate rate in communities of color, right? Whether it's for individuals who were targeted, like Dr. King and other activists, whether it's activities that are monitored, like protests in the Black Lives Matter movement that involve more surveillance than others, whether it's in the name of security, the southern border, the surveillance that is going on there at a greater rate than in other places. And it's not just when we think about, and we talk a lot about things like wrongful arrests, of disproportionately high wrongful arrests by people of color based on facial recognition, where that harm is very concrete, right? Someone was wrongly arrested. Just the fact of being over-surveilled in itself is a harm, because it makes it more difficult for certain people in our society to move about freely, or to feel like they can move about freely with the full protections, without the due process protections, without equal protection under the law that they should have. So the harm starts before some sort of tangible wrongdoing happens. And that brings me to the point of my issue when I thought about this. I thought about how accountability usually occurs, right? So particularly with technology, what happens is a technology is developed, then it is marketed, and then it's deployed. And if it works, or if it's popular, people like it, it is widely deployed. It is put in use. And then after it's put in use for a while, you start seeing problems arising and like, wait a minute, we are seeing some problems here, including bias. And then it's like, oh, well, we need the lawmakers to step in and make some laws and some policies and some regulations to stop these harms that we are seeing as a result. Very rarely do we go back and say, well, who created this? Or start the accountability at the point of creation. Very rarely. We're always catching up from behind, and we do know that the law moves slowly. Technology moves fast. So it's already out the door before that accountability even begins. And that's why, to me, while a lot of the discussion around accountability has focused on whether police should or should not use it, whether cities or towns or states should ban it, how it happens on the ground, I think it should start at the programming. And I think that these corporations who are making these billions of dollars should be held to a much higher standard, and a greater part, actually the lion's share, of the accountability and the law directed to solve this problem should be directed there, not on the ground where the impact is coming so much later. So what does that look like? I have some ideas. One is AI auditing, which is really important. I learned this from the research of Dr. Deb Raji when she was at MIT, who took the data from Microsoft's data encoding from Microsoft in 2017 for their facial recognition technology, and she ran a series of audits and she tested the accuracy against different groups. The only group that had a nearly 100% accuracy when it came to the FRT recognition was white males. Almost perfect. Like, it caught the white males, it got them, it identified them, and knew exactly who they are. Now, when she started looking at women and trans and non-binary folks, men of color, women of color, that accuracy dropped and dropped and dropped down to a point of 80%. Imagine that. It got it wrong 1 in 5 times. Right? And it's important to note, we're talking about accountability. When she did this project in 2017, miraculously by 2018, the program by Microsoft was a lot more accurate. Right? Imagine that. See how that happens. And to that point, there needs to be more transparency. You can't test the data. You can't make sure that the data that is being used is without bias if you can't see it. And it's one area that I hope lawmakers focus more on, is requiring transparency from these tech companies before they can use these products. If so much of these products are being sold to the government, to law enforcement, it's easy. That's an easy check to do. You can put right there in the contract. We will not buy your technology unless you show us the data and let us test it before we put it in place, right? I think that would be a great way to get more accountability very quickly if you make them put their accuracy where their mouth is before those contracts go through. And there also needs to be more diversity among these developers in tech. So yes, here she goes. She's going to talk about DEI. But DEI is important here. It's extraordinarily important here. You need to have the people in the room that can see this data as it's being developed, as it's being used, as this coding is being done. As Dr. Joy Bulam, sorry, I don't mean to, I want to say this right. As Dr. Joy Bulamwini said, she actually wrote it in the Boston Globe opinion piece, so I'm a little biased, but she wrote this really wonderful essay about her experience as a graduate student at MIT, trying to create a new facial recognition program, but implementing coding and data from existing facial recognition programs. And she was trying to get it to work by testing it on her own face. And she was trying and trying, it just wasn't picking up her face. So she thought that there was a technological, a coding issue, a data issue in some sort of technological way. And she kept trying and trying and trying. And so I'm going to read you a little bit of what she wrote about that experience. She said, "At this point, anything was up for grabs. I looked around my office and I saw a white mask. I held it over my face, and a box appeared on the laptop screen. The box signaled that my masked face was detected. I took the mask off, and as my dark-skinned human face came into view, the detection box disappeared. The software did not see me. A bit unsettled, I put the mask back over my face to finish testing the code. Coding in whiteface was not what I expected to do when I came to MIT, but for better or worse, I had encountered what I now call the coded gaze. You need diversity in these tech companies to guard against the coded gaze." I read a very interesting report from RAND as I prepared for this that pointed out, agreed that accountability should start earlier, but as their top priority, they said it needs to be more human oversight wherever AI is being used to make sensitive decisions. I agree with that. I think everything I said before is more important than this, but I do agree that this is important. And this report pointed out the fact that Microsoft President Brad Smith had actually called for lawmakers to do that, saying, as much as tech companies want to stay on top of this, we really need, the people who are elected by the public to be the ones holding folks accountable on this. We really need those human decision makers at the point of AI decisions. And I said, okay, I agree that the humans are important. I agree that we need lawmakers to step up. I don't think that gives the tech companies a pass, because the best experts in place to identify and fix and address this are the tech companies. But I do think that this human touch at these critical points are important. They're really important thing as well. I will use a personal experience to sort of highlight that. It didn't involve facial recognition, but it involved TSA. So I wrote a column about this a couple years ago. I was traveling, actually within Massachusetts, flying from Boston to Martha's Vineyard and back. And for some reason, there was some glitch in the pre-check system that, about a quarter of pre-check folks, it just wasn't populating to their boarding passes. So we couldn't get the, easy access, since we had to do the whole, I was like, oh, it's annoying, but it's fine. I'll take out my laptop, I'll take my shoes off, But instead of going through the regular magnetometer that you get on pre-check, I had to go through the, the scanny thing. And as I'm walking out of the scanny thing, it's summertime, I'm not wearing heavy clothes, I didn't expect any problem. I get told by a TSA agent, just hold on, please, we need to do additional screening. And so I turned around and I looked at the little figure that represented my body, and there was the white box around my head. And I said, oh, I remember this. I had box braids because it was summertime and I had gone to Martha's Vineyard. And, some of us black folks like to wear box braids to the beach. But I recalled from my pre-check days that I would get that yellow box around my head, whether I had my hair like this, or in a little afro puff on top of my head, or however my ethnic hair chose to exist in this, world where ethnic hair is not seen like everybody else's hair. And it resulted in a very intrusive secondary search, one that I felt was very violative. And so then I thought, didn't TSA know that this was a problem a long time ago? In fact, the ACLU sued TSA in 2014. This was happening in 2022. And I got a less than satisfactory answer from that. I will, if you want to see that column, you should read it. It has all the stuff in there. But the point about that human touch, right, is that there were TSA agents right in front of me, seeing me in my little summer dress, coming through with my braids. And if any of them, including the one agent of color who himself had locks, was empowered to say, oh, yes, we know that this can happen with this system. Let's just, I can show them my hair, or I can, move my braids, or even, not ideal, if they want to pat me down in my head, not other parts of my body. But because of their policy, they had to do a certain pat down regardless of where that happened. And that was, in my opinion, a problem. The same thing happens if you're implementing facial recognition technology or anything else when it comes to the bias. So I agree that not just having humans there, but empowering them to make different decisions and to override that algorithm where it is necessary. So, of course, there are other things. Most of the regulations so far that are trying to deal with facial recognition technology is focused more on the ground. There are a lot of cities and towns that have banned it. I'm not sure that a ban is always, we talk about all the good that it happens, it needs to be made better. You have a lot of police departments that have banned it. Now, I support that in cases where it's been used egregiously, in places like Detroit, which has had multiple false arrests of black men and women based on this technology. If that's going on, yes, ban it until you can figure out what you're doing and do it better. And of course, there was a commission in Massachusetts which examined this issue, put together a set of recommendations, and there is now pending a bill to implement those. We're going to talk a lot more about that and more on Wednesday during the panel discussion, and we'll have experts there, so I'm going to leave that part of the discussion for that. And other states, I believe Maine, Montana, have also passed such legislation. That's important. It's a good tool, and it's important to have this discussion to figure it all out, but that certainly is not enough. And just a word on judges making the decision in these cases too, and I suspect could be the case with some lawmakers, which is why you really need community members and the people who are affected by this at the table too. Is I recall when I thought about how judges may consider, challenges or 1983 actions or something after the fact, when rights are violated, I remember covering the Supreme Court, and it was a case that involved a pager. And the issue was whether a government worker had any privacy in the text messages he or she was sending on their government-issued, it wasn't even a phone, it was remember pagers? It was a government-issued pager. Now, this argument was happening in the mid-teens, but it took so long for the appeal to make it to the Supreme Court that they were talking about pagers when nobody was still using pagers. That's sort of how the law was slow. But even with that, the Supreme Court justices' unfamiliarity with texting was mind-boggling. I remember Scalia asking, can you print out these, some of the messages at issue were of a sexual nature. So Scalia said, can you print out these spicy little missives? How does it work? Who can get them? How does Justice Kennedy was asking, does it beam into the air, and then where does it go before it goes to the... I'm sitting there in disbelief at how little they understood, and I wrote a blog post about it, and it crashed Mass Lawyers Weekly's website. So many people picked it up, Drudge picked it up, and the Wall Street Journal's blog. But that just shows you judges are sometimes the last people who should be making decisions about how this stuff works. And that's also something to keep in mind when you're drafting these laws and thinking about policy. Who's going to have the final say? Maybe it's not always the judge. And I appreciate judges, I do. But, and lawmakers as well, but they're not always the experts. So I want to save plenty of time for your questions, and I hope you have a lot of them, because I'm better at answering questions than I am at lecturing. But I really appreciate the time to discuss this issue that is so important to me. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. There's so much there. I think we will have, I hope we have a good number of questions. We usually give priority to students first, which we will allow you to self-identify as a student, because my facial recognition technology is not perfect. I'll say for my part, the phrase spicy little missives has stuck in my mind for a long time. I hadn't heard that one before. Student questions, we have mics, and please identify yourself briefly and go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Zoe. I'm a 2L. I was just wondering if you've seen within these tech companies any of them take steps forward to maybe put some of the safety rails on that you're speaking about.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen some efforts to increase transparency, to a lot, I believe Microsoft is a part of a partnership with other tech experts in order to do better testing of their own coding and their own data to ensure that some of this, you see them responding to it, but that's usually the point, right? They're usually responding to a problem that already exists as opposed to stepping up and doing it themselves. I was actually under a wrongful assumption before I started looking into this to speak to you. I remember when Rite Aid stopped using facial recognition in their stores. And I was like, right on, Rite Aid, that's great. Then it turns out the FTC said, if you don't stop, we are going to, there are going to be some repercussions. So they didn't do it of their own volition, right? You had a government agency forcing them to do it. So there has been some movement, but they usually need to be prodded. Yeah. Okay, now don't be like me in the back, just anything? I will, based on what you just said, it is a point that I think is important when it comes to having humans, both in the coding, at the coding level, who are more diverse, as well as on the implementation level that are more diverse, because there's something real called racial blindness without computers. Humans, all of us, are better at recognizing the faces of people within our own race than of the faces of people in other races. So even if you have people who are really committed to weeding out this bias, if those people can't see it, then you can't weed it out. So that's another DEI plug for me about why you need that diversity in all of these areas. So that made me think of that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alex.
Hi, Alex.
I just had a question about sort of where in the chain of events or in the various places where this could be an issue you're most concerned. So for example, you've got the technology, and you could regulate the creation of the technology. You could regulate its sale to private individuals. You could be regulating its sale to police departments or something, or you could be regulating its use by police departments. So, and some of those seem like very different things.
Yes.
Which one is most concerning to you, or are they all concerning? Because it seems to me, just on the private side, like maybe if the facial recognition is inaccurate on my iPhone, people will notice that and say, hey, my iPhone's not working, and then the market will fix that problem. But that may not happen in police departments.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think it's important at all levels, but I also think that the less enforcement you have earlier on in the process, the worse it will be when it finally hits the ground and can harm people the most, right? So if there is more enforcement holding developers accountable, as a result, you will have fewer people wrongly arrested and, heaven forbid, convicted on erroneous evidence, right? You do need the watchdog at that level too, but the combination of all of those watchdogs at all of those levels will make it all the more safe, will put more guardrails, and also, to go back to my first point, make it an efficient tool, make it a tool that we can use. I do want people who, engage in crime, who commit crimes, to be identified. But with all of the problems and the biases in it, and that causes it to be banned, that means there will be less. I do think it's better for fewer people, for fewer criminals to be arrested than for any innocent people to be arrested or convicted, but that's an important public policy too. So I think the better enforcement you have at all levels, the more efficiently and accurately it works.
I wonder if I could jump in. I had a sort of a follow-up question to that. As you were talking, I was thinking that there is a danger, it's a sort of subtle big picture problem, that the more government becomes confident in technological ways of identifying people, the more government tends to feel comfortable relying on that for high-stakes determinations. I was remembering after 9/11 when they had these watch lists for people, and then suddenly Ted Kennedy ended up on the watch list because it turns out he wasn't the only person named Ted Kennedy, apparently. And that it goes along with another trend, which is how much less we seem to be valuing privacy in all of its incarnations.
Yes.
Because it's not just our public persona now, it's our public persona has become our avatar, which has become our identification. And in my field of migration law, this has been a big issue, where governments are checking people before they ever even get on the plane. You know, they're buying the tickets.
Yeah.
I wonder, I mean, you've talked about that in various ways. I wonder if you wanted to expand a little bit of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I
Those two
think,
things.
yeah, no, that is a very, yes. The breadth of it can in itself be a problem, especially when that over-reliance, as you say. I mean, think about things like, it could be high and low tech. Like, think about things like rape kits, where you think, wow, this is a great tool to use to help solve crimes. It is, until you see a situation like what happened in Massachusetts with these labs doing terrible jobs, not keeping safe this evidence, running tests that aren't accurate, both because of human reasons and also for mechanical reasons. DNA, when that emerged as a criminal justice evidentiary tool, that was seen as like, woohoo, we got it. Like, this is it. We know we can find these people for, down to a millibit of accuracy. Well, DNA evidence can be lost in the chain of custody. It can be misidentified. It can be, mishandled. So that's why, for me, one concern that I have with facial recognition, the same as with DNA, is yes, it's a good tool, but we need to keep all of the constitutional and legal protections in place. People were trying to use, in my opinion, DNA or facial recognition to get around Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment. You need all those things still there because you have to have a burden of proof presented in that. A related issue is the fact that so many people have either, we all gave our faces to Apple. We did. We gave our faces to Apple. Apple can give that information to the police. Apple can do that, and that circumvents the Fourth Amendment's requirement for a warrant. Increasingly, one of the tools that you see in a lot of this proposed legislation, including the one in Massachusetts, that it would require a warrant. It sort of puts the Fourth Amendment back into this process. But the constitutional protections become so important when you're talking about that reliance and that breadth of use. So that's a great question.
Remember, my college roommate had a poster that said, if you put all your eggs in one basket, you better keep a really close eye on that basket. Any other questions? Okay, faculty, Pat?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Pat McCoy, and I teach here. Welcome here. I was listening and thinking, the pessimist in me could see some improvement in narrowing gaps, but not closing them. And we could land in sort of a purgatory of, well, what's next? Do we tolerate smaller gaps, but ones that still are very injurious to the people affected, or do we require zero tolerance, or how do you navigate that quandary?
Yeah, it's tough, right? I mean, I think that it's true. I think especially in the criminal justice context, as I said, I think any wrongful arrest or conviction needs to be guarded, and I will take, a lack of convictions, any number, I'll take 20 lack of convictions to prevent one wrongful conviction. So you have to, that's part of the discussion that people have to make, and I think that gets to my point that it can't just be made by law enforcement. It can't just be made by elected officials. You need stakeholders at the table to discuss how this is impacting people. At the end of the day, policy always involves some sort of balancing. It has to, or else nothing will get done. You will. What's the phrase? You, in search of the perfect, you eliminate the good. But that balancing needs to be particularly tuned to that potential harm, right, that you talked about. And in those cases, I think you really need to lean on the side of protection, and leaning into those constitutional protections, I think, is one way to do it. If you're talking about other things, the balance might be differently struck, if that makes sense.
I saw a student, yeah, there.
Hi, my name is Maggie Cooney. I'm a 3L. I got my degree in electrical engineering, and
Fantastic.
a lot of my classes were focused on coding and things like that. And I found that bias in data was very rarely, if ever, talked about. So my question is, what role do you think that universities have to play in this? Because I felt like there was a lack of responsibility for the data that you were using because it was never discussed. And so you have engineers starting at these tech companies already feeling like, you know, the data is something separate from them and they're not responsible for it.
That's a wonderful question, and I think that there is a huge responsibility on the part of educators and educational institutions to teach about these biases. I mean, like in the case of the grad student from MIT that I pointed out, it was her who came up with this, and that became groundbreaking research. You know, the coded gaze is a phrase she coined as a student when she found it from her lived experience. It wasn't taught to her by MIT, and that's a really, really good, thank you for pointing that out. That's a really important, even before the coding is developed, you have to have people who are well educated in these fields to recognize bias along with, as they learn the code, as they learn all of the basics. So that's a wonderful point, thank you.
I think you could also have nefarious actors in the system manipulating data behind the scene. I mean, not to get too paranoid about it, but that's another concern.
That is intentional.
Hello, my name's George. I'm also a 3L. Thank you for coming. My question is, what has the response been amongst police departments to the problems of this technology? Some have given it up or slowed down their adoption, but I imagine they've, like Reddit, been told to stop by lawmakers or local governments. So I guess how have they been responding to this sometimes super inaccurate and very harmful technology?
Yeah, it's a mix, right? And I'm not sure they all have been urged to stop using this, even when bias is apparent. I mean, to get back to my example in Detroit, it's taken a threatening of a lawsuit by the ACLU of Michigan to get Detroit to stop, despite these documented cases of misidentifications. In other places, by contrast to Massachusetts, there was a push by the ACLU to address this. And then even before this legislation was filed, you had a lot of cities and towns that voluntarily stopped using it. I believe that Somerville was the first, and Boston followed suit. Cambridge, I think maybe half a dozen others of their own volition said that they would stop using it even before this legislation passed. So I think it depends on where you are. Certainly probably depends on what part of the country. And it depends on the pushback, honestly, from FOP and other pro-law enforcement groups that have a lot of lobbying power that push back against the idea of giving this up by saying, we have crime and we need to have that war on crime, and pushing that same narrative that, of fear. And people think that they need this to keep their communities safe and would rather err on the side of using it than on the potential protections of others.
I have a question here. Abby, do we have anybody online? Can you check? No? Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Adriana. I'm a 3L. So for me, I think a federal regulatory agency like that could be a really potentially effective, not solution, but a way to ensure accountability and reliability, uniformity. But with the potential overturning of Chevron, do you think that forecloses that possibility as it being an effective solution?
All right, we said we weren't going to cold call on administrative law questions.
No,
so feel free to.
I was an admin law nerd, and that was my best grade in law school, so I can talk Chevron. Yeah, it's a problem when you take away the ability of federal agencies to be able to enact the kind of rules that Congress intended for them to enact in order to address these needs. And these are the places where there are experts in place. There are experts, unlike the Supreme Court justice that didn't know how texting worked. You have experts in these federal agencies that know how to deal with that, whether it's the creation of a specific agency for this, or whether it's a unit within DOJ, or within we talked about the FTC and the CFPB when it comes to financial facial recognition use and protections and privacy. So yeah, that's where the action is on a federal level. I do believe, especially with police departments, you also really need local rules, because each police department is staffed differently, operates differently, has different equipment, and it's a little harder to regulate that on a federal level. But yes, Chevron is, the impending death of Chevron is a problem. And also just already the dramatic rollback of the authority of federal agencies from the EPA to others that has already been done by the courts is a massive problem addressing this, yes.
There's a question back there.
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm with 3L. Thanks for coming. So much of this talk has been about eliminating error, and whether it be racial bias or just plain error. Give it, like, let's say they're counterfactual and it's 100% accurate. I know Professor Ketchum kind of touched on this, but do you have any pause about facial recognition that's, let's say, is 100% accurate? We could solve, crimes. We could have our technology that improves life. And then, if you do, how do you get people to care about that?
I don't have any. As I said, I think that facial recognition technology is a wonderful development. I think the more accurate it is, the more wonderful it is, obviously. If we can get to 100% accuracy, I think that's the goal. I think these are the things that can help us get to, as I said, my solution isn't banning it. My solution is fixing it. So I think if we can get to 100%, that would be great, but we still need those constitutional protections in place, because we don't know when, what, or whether some other sort of issue may pop up. So I think first and foremost, the idea should be protecting the Fourth Amendment rights. You can't get this stuff unless you make a certain showing, making sure the people that are accused of this have the right access to an attorney, that they're not incriminating themselves just by showing up to the police department. I mean, you have to have all of those safeguards that the Constitution laid out hundreds of years ago in place, in addition to this wonderful, even very accurate tool. The same with DNA. I feel exactly the same way. So I think the accuracy alone isn't in itself a perfect protection, even if it is at 100%.
So I'm sure we're going to talk about this more on Wednesday. I would just say, personally, I just have to weigh in. I think a world without anonymity, without even the possibility of anonymity, for me, is a pretty scary world. But maybe that has already passed us by. The other thing I would note, and this is a bigger issue in Europe than it is here, but there are people who, for religious reasons, cover their faces with hijabs, burqas, various other things. And if suddenly the world is such that you need your face as the currency of the realm in order to do everything, then those people are deeply marginalized and perhaps personally marginalized. So that's another.
And in response to your first point, I think for the convenience, we make a lot of trade-offs, right?
Yeah.
And so I am less, my face is out there. Why? Because I want to do this, right? You trade off things. We talked about doing the DNA testing, which I wish I hadn't done with, Ancestry and all of that. I wanted to know my background, and as an exchange in that bargain, I gave away some information that now, maybe in retrospect, I wish I didn't. But in other places, and if it gets too ubiquitous, like I went to China, and like to buy some water, they wanted, like, nope, you gotta download this app, and then you just walk through the store and you take the water, and we see you, we know who you paid, and it just takes that. I'm like, oh no, like, there is no way. Not only did I not download the app, not only did I pay with a credit card, but I was it's sort of like I'm walking through the store like that, because that was really creepy. The level of surveillance in that country
and somebody somewhere
was gobsmacking.
Somebody somewhere is thinking, tell me about that thing you did when you were 18, because it suddenly just popped up on the screen.
Oh, that was a level of surveillance. That was just what I know.
Yeah.
They probably were surveilling in any number of ways that I didn't know. But I don't want to live in a country like that. No, to that point, yes.
All right, we have a couple more minutes. If anybody has another question. I will recommend, by the way, the worst, most ridiculous, but totally you can't stop watching it movie about this is called Face Off, which is John Travolta and Nick. Have you ever seen that movie? It is the worst movie in the world. They switch faces and then switch identities, but you can't stop watching it. I don't know if you had that experience.
I could stop watching.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, it's horrible, but it's right on point. All right, well,
Can I just add one point about Wednesday?
yeah, please.
The government, the state commission that Kim referenced, on Wednesday, we have 2 members of that commission, one who voted to recommend the results of the commission, and one who voted not to recommend. So we'll have
Oh,
a
good.
very lively discussion.
It'll be a good discussion.
Well, thank you so much. This is a fantastic show.